Louisiana, a land rich in history and resources, originally the home of the Natchez, the Homer, and the Choctaw, but the adopted home of Iberville, Bienville, and Tonti. Louisiana, the focus of international struggle and intrigue for centuries, a place of mystique, the home of a people known for distinct culture and institutions, the parish and police jury. Louisiana, that catalyst for transforming the former British North American colonies into a national melting pot. Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz, the refinement of blues and the gospel, the source of Creole and Cajun food, the home of Huey Long and Evangeline, Lee Armstrong and Marie Laveau. The Louisiana Purchase, arguably the world's most significant real estate transaction, will be the subject of this semester-long series, both on its immediate importance but its continuing impact today. Welcome to the second lecture in our continuing series on Louisiana Purchase. This week's lecture is given by Professor and past Chair Merrill Johnson of the Department of Geography. He has also been Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. He is well prepared to talk about the geography of the Purchase area, having lived in several parts of it. Merrill was born in Kansas, spent much of his youth in Texas, Colorado, Nebraska, and Canada, where he graduated from school in London, Ontario. This lecture will place the Louisiana Purchase in a geographical context. In 1800, Louisiana was largely unknown to most Americans, a land with raging volcanoes, lumbering Macedons, and mountains of pure salt, many thought. Johnson would examine the real geography of the Purchase, how it was integrated spatially into the rest of the United States, and its continuing relevance to the economic well-being of the country today.
One of the world's great real estate transactions occurred in 1803 when the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. It is difficult to overstate the significance of this acquisition to the United States. Much of modern America's heartland came out of this purchase, along with numerous states, farming regions, and at least part of the area that figured prominently in America's fabled Old West. Yes, indeed, had it not been for the Louisiana Purchase, gunslingers in Dodge City might have been calling each other out into the street in Spanish or French. It's appropriate, therefore, that we devote a course such as this to an investigation of the events and processes that led to the Louisiana Purchase. In the broadcasts that follow, you will be treated to a series of lectures by very gifted scholars who will discuss the dynamics surrounding this momentous event in history. Today, however, I want to establish context, particularly a geographical context to which future talks can be related. In so doing, I wish to examine several questions. First, what did people in the late 18th and early 19th centuries know about their world? In fact, they had a very different understanding of their world, one that we need to be aware of before we giggle about some of the assumptions they made about the Louisiana Purchase. Second, what was contained in the physical geography of the Purchase area itself? Third, how was the Purchase area explored and open for settlement? Fourth, how was the Purchase integrated into the political geography of the United States? And finally, what is the significance of the Louisiana Purchase to the contemporary human geography of the United States? And I'll give you a hint, it was not a bad deal. In addition, we will examine the dual geographical nature of the Purchase. That is to say, while a single transfer of territory was made in 1803, the geographical reality that emerged is one of two distinct regions within the Purchase territory. There are eastern and western parts with quite different characteristics and development trajectories. In a sense, I will be telling a tale of two purchases. Let's first set the stage for the Louisiana Purchase by noting that President Jefferson's land deal was a whole lot larger than he originally bargained for. Jefferson was initially interested in acquiring only New Orleans and West Florida, not a piece of real estate equal to the existing United States. The problem, in simple geographical terms, was that the United States controlled most of the Mississippi Basin east of the river itself. Actually, the river was the country's western boundary as of 1783. But Spain, and later Napoleon's France, controlled the port of New Orleans, where Mississippi boatmen deposited their goods. The Spanish were creating problems for these boatmen, and Jefferson concluded that the purchase of New Orleans would solve the problem. The U.S. emissaries to France, Livingston and Monroe, made an offer to the French government. Let me note parenthetically that Livingston and Monroe were operating on the assumption that France possessed Louisiana, a controversial point that I will explore further below. Napoleon was in a giving mood in light of recent French military disasters on the island of Hispaniola and his concern for British and Spanish intentions in the New World, and he agreed to sell not only New Orleans but all of the mainland North American territory attached to New Orleans. The stunned U.S. negotiators in Paris went out on a limb, so to speak, and accepted the offer. The purchase price was $15 million, amounting to only pennies an acre, a good buy even in the early 19th century. Suddenly, the United States was twice its original size. The problem is, Napoleon did not quite know what he was selling, and the Americans did not quite know what they were buying. Everybody agreed that the Louisiana Territory was a big piece of land that extended west of the Mississippi River to the Rockies, wherever they were, and as far north as the British territories in Canada, however they were delineated. In fact, much of the geography of North America remained a mystery to Jefferson and to Napoleon. But then, most people who lived in the early 19th century, even the most educated people, knew surprisingly little about the world, at least if you measure knowledge by 21st century standards. Let's digress for a moment and talk about what was known in 1800, which will give us a geographical context in which we can place the Louisiana Purchase. In so doing, let's look at several geographical issues that vexed explorers and shaped geographical understandings before 1800, issues that shed some light on why people knew or did not know what they did. First, by 1800, sailors finally could take long voyages without getting sick from scurvy, a debilitating disease resulting from vitamin deficiency that sometimes killed so many sailors that only ghost ships were left. Fresh fruits and vegetables provided the cure, particularly citrus fruit, hence the term limey for British sailors. While the first evidence of a food connection to scurvy was found in the early 1600s, it was not until the 1770s and the second voyage of Captain Cook that this connection was systematically tested. Extended voyages of discovery could now be taken to map the continents without half the crew succumbing to vitamin deficiency disease. Second, long before 1800, ship captains could plot the directions in which they were headed and their latitudes, that is, how far north or south they were located. But they had a terrible time finding their longitudes, or how far east or west they were positioned. The magnetic compass, invented by the Chinese, was introduced into Europe in the late 1100s and was used consistently to indicate direction by the early 1700s. Sailors had at least some understanding of how to establish latitude going back to the ancient Greeks. They simply measured the distance between a celestial feature, perhaps the sun or a star, and the horizon. By 1759, the first sextant was developed, which is an instrument still used today, by the way. But longitude had no easy fix. The problem was that in order to compute longitude, the ship needed a really good clock, one that would remain accurate within a few seconds over long distances and in rolling seas. In 1714, the British Parliament, exasperated by sailors' ineptitude in determining longitude and the periodic naval disasters that resulted, offered a reward of £20,000 to anyone who could build such a clock. By the way, That was a lot of money. In 1729, the clockmaker John Harrison accepted the challenge. After years of effort, or perhaps we should say decades of effort, Harrison finally submitted a clock in 1761. The clock was tested multiple times, and in each instance it lost only seconds over thousands of miles. In 1775, the 82-year-old Harrison was awarded the prize. But he died soon thereafter, and who knows from what, maybe his time was up. On a related note, it is interesting to observe that explorers like Lewis and Clark still struggled with longitude in the early 1800s. Third, by 1800, mariners had good maps for navigation so long as they were not concerned about a completely accurate portrayal of coastlines or the relative sizes of continents. The standard map or chart in use, the Mercator projection, was first produced in 1569 and offered the advantage of straight line bearings. In other words, ships' navigators could use straight lines to plot their courses. The downside of the Mercator projection is that it exaggerates land masses at high latitudes, so that Greenland, for example, appears much larger than South America when, in fact, Greenland is only a fraction of South America's size. Furthermore, because the map is the equivalent of a projection of the globe onto a paper cylinder, with the paper touching the globe at the equator, the North and South poles are completely missing. Anybody using a Mercator projection in 1800 would have seen immense, unknown land masses in North America, exaggerated in significance by the map's projection. Believe it or not, the Mercator projection remains popular today as a classroom map. By the way, speaking of mapping oddities, it was not until the 1760s that cartographers stopped embellishing blank spaces on their maps with dragons, elephants, and whatever weird creatures their imaginations conjured. Finally, by 1800, the myth of a great southern continent was dispelled once and for all. This continent, called Terra Australis Incognita, was supposed to line the southern edges of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Why was this believed? Because Ptolemy, the first-century Greek scholar and geographer, said so, and European cartographers and explorers simply assumed that he was right. But nobody had actually seen the continent, and it took the second voyage of Captain Cook, 1768 to 1771, to show that the continent really did not exist, with the exception, obviously, of Antarctica. In brief, 1800 was not far removed from a period in history in which great myths and inaccuracies existed about our knowledge of the world. It was not until the late 1700s that we finally could claim a general knowledge of continental shapes and locations, thanks in no small measure to the voyages of Captain Cook. More to the point, by 1800 the configurations of continents on maps bore at least a general resemblance to what we would expect to see today. What we did not know much about in 1800, and this brings us back to the Louisiana Purchase, was the geography of many continental interiors, including North America. In fact, our knowledge was appallingly deficient. Thomas Jefferson, the great scholar and visionary who had studied the West, still believed in 1800 that giant mammoths or mastodons roamed the West, that Western climates were more temperate than those in the East, that Western grasslands existed not because of dry climates, but because the soils were too rich to support trees, that a mountain of salt 180 miles long and 45 miles wide lay in the West, that the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia might be the highest on the continent, and any western mountains that existed could be crossed in a day. And finally, and perhaps of greatest importance to Jefferson, that there was easy river access to the Pacific Ocean. To paraphrase Professor Allen, Jefferson's decades of research on the West allowed him to present a more detailed description of the West than most of his contemporaries. But in the final analysis, it was a description based more on the geography of the imagination than the geography of reality. At this time in history, even really bright people had really bad ideas about continental interiors. We can observe how deficient our understanding of North America was by examining some period maps. Look, for example, at this 1776 map of Western North America. Do you see a Rocky Mountain chain? Neither do I. Look at Western Canada and note how it's cut into islands and ocean passages as far east as Hudson Bay. It almost appears as if you could sail through the continent here as if it were a Northwest Passage, which of course is material for another class. Oh, if such were to be true, the modern Manitoba wheat farmer might muse, so he could ship his grain by boat rather than by train. Look at the 1802 map of North America. It's a little better, but not much, especially when you look west of the Mississippi River. Yes, the islands, inlets, and bays that penetrated into central Canada have been removed. But do you see any Rocky Mountains? Once again, neither do I. What we see is a blank space where the Rockies should be. In the old days, a map maker might have filled this space with a dragon's head. Further examination of the 1802 map shows that the territory called Louisiana was defined fundamentally by a system of rivers that flowed into the Mississippi. We knew about rivers such as the Missouri and the Platte. We just didn't know much about where they came from or what they ran through. As of 1802, the United States extended westward only to the Mississippi River, as the 1799 school map shows. Even in the east, we still had some uncertainty about locations. Look, for example, at the highly incomplete and perhaps a little conjectural representation of the old northwest frontier. Look also at the boundary line, or absence thereof, separating Maine from Canada. By today's standards, however, this type of uncertainty is unknown. Thanks to satellite technology, every square mile of the United States not only can be accounted for, but can be classified and shown in a planimetrically precise way. Small pixels of terrestrial space can be manipulated to show elevation, as the displayed image indicates. Now there is no mistaking the presence of the Rockies. Now we see clearly how few passages and inlets are found in central Canada. Armed with our contemporary computer-enhanced knowledge, we can thoroughly describe the physical setting that embraced the Louisiana Purchase. For our purposes, we will do this by superimposing a map of the Louisiana Purchase over a map of the landforms of the United States. The physical geography of the Purchase is comprised mainly of flat to rolling terrain broken in places by the downward cutting of the many streams and rivers that flow out of the Rockies en route to the Mississippi River. As the drainage pattern suggests, there is a gradual decrease in elevation eastward from the Rockies. There are several, quote, interruptions to the flat to rolling pattern, including the Boston and Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, very low-lying mountains that owe their existence to processes that we associate with the formation of the Appalachians, and the Ozark Plateau of Missouri. In addition, we find the Black Hills of South Dakota and a number of badlands as we approach the Rocky Mountains. In the western part of the Purchase and at the doorstep of the Rockies, we find the Great Plains, one of the flattest pieces of real estate on the earth. Some of the most important rivers in North America flow from the land contained in the Purchase, including the Missouri River in the north, the Platte and Arkansas rivers in the center, and the Red River in the south. The importance of these rivers cannot be overstated. They served as corridors to the west. They provided water for irrigation and drinking. They formed rich alluvial soils for farming, and they offered decision makers easy places to locate boundaries, a point that I will return to below. Thomas Jefferson was interested, of course, in the farming potential of the Purchase. This potential is a function of soils and climate, which are interrelated. The eastern part of the purchase area has a relatively moist, humid continental or humid subtropical climate, while the western part of the purchase has a drier steppe climate. Soils generally favor agriculture, although toward the west the absence of water makes using the soils more of a challenge. The physical setting of the purchase had geopolitical implications. We will observe first that the purchase included only the western part of a very large region called the interior lowlands, which lie between the Appalachian highlands in the east and the Rocky Mountains in the west, and are drained by the Mississippi River system. Consistent with common practice among boundary makers, the Louisiana Territory used a river, the Mississippi River, as a boundary line, which effectively split what otherwise was a natural physical region defined by the Mississippi River and its tributaries. By the way, we can be forgiven for thinking that Mother Nature gave us rivers just so that they could be used as boundaries, considering how often they are used for that purpose. Now, it is true that rivers often do make good boundaries. For example, they can be used like a moat to separate you from your enemies. On the other hand, splitting a river basin with a boundary can in itself become a provocation. It's hard to believe, for instance, that many Americans, given their 19th century mindsets, would have permanently acquiesced to the Spanish or French or whoever controlling and populating the western half of this physical region. Jefferson perhaps didn't know it at the time, but his purchase of all of the Louisiana Territory, not just New Orleans, created a geographic unity in the interior that may have postponed or prevented future conflict. Second, the southern part of the purchase lies in the Gulf and Atlantic coastal plain, which stretches the length of the Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas. Only that part of the coastal plain embracing the lower Mississippi Delta was included in the purchase, thereby inserting a wedge into the coastal plain. In a sense, the Louisiana Territory was shaped, to borrow from a famous expression, like a dagger pointed at the heart of the Gulf of Mexico. Without for a moment wanting to suggest that geography determines politics, the way in which the coastal plain was split by the lower part of the purchase was bound to promote conflict, and it later did. After concluding this mother of all real estate deals, the question for Jefferson became, what did the United States get? Or more specifically, how much real estate did the United States actually acquire, and what was contained in this real estate? Let's look at the size of the transaction first. Neither Livingston nor Monroe, the U.S. negotiators in Paris, knew precisely where the borders of this new property lay. And by the way, neither did the French. When asked what the U.S. had purchased, Monsieur Talleyrand, Napoleon's rather devious minister for foreign relations, remarked in a typically confusing manner that he didn't know, but the Americans should make full use of what they got. Talleyrand's ignorance was authentic, but it was also convenient. Authentic because he, like most everybody else in Europe, had no clue about what lay in North America's interior. And convenient because Napoleon wanted fuzzy boundary lines to distract the political powers in North America. The French could then stand on the sidelines and watch the Americans, Spanish, and British pick at each other over boundary issues related to America's acquisition of the Louisiana Territory. Indeed, the only clearly defined borders were along the Mississippi River in the east and the Gulf of Mexico in the south. And Napoleon got what he asked for. Over the next 2 decades, the United States was in constant negotiation and periodic confrontation with Spain over the boundary with Texas and with Britain over the boundary with what is now Canada. Eventually, the border disputes were resolved. In 1818, the 49th parallel was established as the dividing line between Canada and the United States, in the process cutting off a small piece of the purchase in the interest of boundary line tidiness. In the following year, the United States and Spain agreed to place the southwestern boundary of the purchase along the Sabine and Red Rivers. And then after some winding northward along the 42nd parallel westward to the Pacific Ocean. After all was said and done, the United States gave back to Spain that part of the original purchase that is now the Texas Panhandle. Throughout, Spain was not in a particularly good mood about the purchase. Spain had acquired Louisiana from the French in 1762 as part of a general territorial house cleaning that came out of what we remember as the French and Indian War. Spain agreed to cede Louisiana back to the French in 1802 in return for some European lands. Napoleon reneged on the bargain, at least his end of the bargain, and the question arose whether, because of his deceit, he really had clear title to the land that he sold to the United States. What if the United States just paid the French $15 million for somebody else's land? What a deal for the French. Suffice it to say that the issue effectively became moot not long after the United States took possession of Louisiana. Regardless how the final boundaries were defined and the status of the title, it's worth repeating that the United States received a huge territory. Let's return to the map that I referred to earlier, modified to include some of the boundary corrections that were made along the way. A person could travel from the subtropics of the Gulf Coast to the frigid steppes of the northern Great Plains and never leave the purchase. Note that, as the red tint on the map indicates, the purchase was a very large and empty land, at least in terms of European settlement. The only settled parts were St. Louis, a town of about 1,000 people in 1800, the area around New Orleans, and a few pockets that lay in between. With the boundaries settled, we can go to the second question raised earlier. What did this vast territory contain? Finding out what the United States got became a high priority for President Jefferson and subsequent presidents, and led to a series of high-profile exploratory expeditions. The purposes of these missions were, quite literally, to take inventory, to catalog the flora and the fauna, to evaluate the agricultural value of the soils, to identify and describe indigenous populations, to map the terrain, and perhaps of greatest importance to people like Jefferson, to ascertain the commercial value of the new territory. Indeed, Jefferson held out hope that a water corridor to the Pacific with perhaps a low portage en route would provide a foundation for an American as opposed to a British or a Spanish-dominated Western commerce. No doubt the highest profile expedition was that of Lewis and Clark. In early 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out with a party of roughly 30 soldiers and volunteers to explore the regions drained by the Missouri and Columbia rivers. Jefferson's orders were clear and reflected his strategic and commercial thinking. The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as, by its course in communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or any other river may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. Jefferson stressed the importance of understanding the geography of the lands through which Lewis and Clark passed. Again, as Jefferson expressed it, beginning at the mouth of the Missouri, you will take careful observations of latitude and longitude at all remarkable points on the river, and especially at the mouths of rivers, at rapids, at islands, and at other places and objects distinguished by such natural marks and characters of a durable kind. In September of 1806, the expedition returned to St. Louis, largely safe and sound, having suffered only one fatality en route. Lewis and Clark had collected a wealth of information, not all of which constituted good news to Jefferson. Specifically, the Louisiana Purchase abutted a series of mountain ranges that dwarfed the Appalachians and made easy passage to the Pacific little more than a fantasy. Jefferson received a lesson in geography that he neither anticipated nor appreciated. On the other hand, Lewis and Clark produced the first good geographical understanding of the northern part of the purchase, an understanding that quickly acquired commercial significance. Within a few years of Lewis and Clark's return to St. Louis, explorers, trappers, and merchants were opening up the purchase. Agents of Manuel Lisa, a St. Louis merchant, traced the steps of Lewis and Clark and established a trading post at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Bighorn Rivers in 1807, exploring much of Montana and Wyoming in the process. By 1811, employees of John Jacob Astor reached the mouth of the Columbia, where they founded the settlement of Astoria. In addition, they helped to open what constituted a transcontinental superhighway of the time across the purchase, the famous Oregon Trail. Along with Lewis and Clark, another Army officer, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, helped Americans to understand what was contained in this vast territory. His first trip in 1804 took him north to search for the headwaters of the Mississippi and to assert a U.S. claim to the adjacent territory. Pike thought he had discovered the origin of the Mississippi, but his discovery later proved to be wrong. Pike's second trip, between 1805 and 1807, took his party through the central part of the purchase to explore the Arkansas and Red River regions. He made it to Colorado, where he unsuccessfully attempted to climb the mountain later named after him, Pike's Peak. He then proceeded southward from Colorado into Spanish territory, where he was taken into custody by the Spanish and escorted back to the Spanish-American border with Louisiana. In other words, escorted back to the purchase. Major Stephen Long led another government expedition into the purchase in 1819 and 1820 with the goal of finding and mapping the western and southern boundaries of the purchase. He was not completely successful, having altogether missed the true southern boundary, the Red River. But Major Long also got a mountain named after him, Long's Peak in Colorado, and his reconnaissance led to the creation of the Santa Fe Trail, America's early commercial corridor to Spanish America. As an aside, it's interesting to observe that because of the journeys of explorers like Lewis, Clark, Pike, and Long, the United States was using the purchase to provide corridors into the domains of two potential competitors for land in North America, the British in the northwest by the way of the Oregon Trail, and the Spanish in the southwest via the Santa Fe Trail. Both Pike and Long were distressed by what they found in the western part of the purchase. They thought that it was a desert, a wasteland unfit for settlement. Pike went so far as to comment that, and I quote, "These vast plains of the western hemisphere may become in time equally celebrated as the sandy deserts of Africa." In so doing, both Pike and Long created an image of the Great American Desert, an image that prevailed for decades after their expeditions and made the Louisiana Territory into a tale of two purchases, a western wasteland that should be avoided except to pass through en route to the far west, and an eastern half that could be settled and made productive. Pike's and Long's Great American Desert occupied much of today's Great Plains. Much of the land is flat, the climate is dry but wet enough to support a cover of short grasses. Trees are usually restricted to river and stream beds. The soils, while hardly infertile, are often difficult to work because of their compaction and hardness. Indeed, settlers later discovered that they could use slabs of sod cut from the soil to make huts. Nothing stylish, mind you, but adequate protection from the elements. Add to these conditions high winds, unrelenting summer heat, and sub-zero cold in the winter, and one can understand the early tendency of settlers to pass through the land, not settle on it. Actually, the Great American Desert was not really a desert. It was not dry enough to be a desert, but in the early history of Western settlement, this part of the purchase was what we might describe today as a leapfrog zone. Settlers leapfrogged over the Great American Desert en route to more appealing lands in the far west. Settlement patterns reflected that, quote, tale of two purchases theme. By 1835, American settlement had spread into the eastern part of the Louisiana Purchase, filling in the lower Mississippi River between New Orleans and St. Louis. Settlements, not necessarily American settlements, were becoming well established in Mexican-owned central Texas and California. Note that most of the Louisiana Purchase was not settled, certainly not the Great American Desert. By 1850, differences with Mexico had led to the acquisition of Texas and California, and American migration to these new territories was widespread. Notice that within the Purchase itself, settlement remained concentrated in the St. Louis to New Orleans corridor. Almost all of Louisiana was settled, as were territories immediately to the west of the Mississippi River in Arkansas and Missouri. The southern Purchase region was settled as a corridor for settlers entering Texas, as the increased settlement of eastern Texas suggests. The Great American Desert remained what we might call today flyover country. By 1890, flyover country was beginning to receive settlers of its own. The Great American Desert was no longer a part of the country over which migrants leapfrogged. The technologies of America's 19th century Industrial Revolution helped. For instance, the windmill made extracting water from vast underground aquifers easy to do. Barbed wire could be used in place of scarce lumber for fences. New plows were introduced to break the sod, and of course the railroad provided a heretofore unheard of level of mobility. In addition, the threat of hostile Plains Indians had largely been eliminated by 1890 by methods that we all acknowledge were hardly commendable. Once these obstacles were overcome, this vast grassland could be used to grow a particularly valuable type of grass called wheat. If conditions were too harsh for wheat, then livestock grazing was possible. A review of the map shows that much of the Great American Desert in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming had been put to the plow or made into grazing land by 1890. In addition, the eastern half of the Purchase north of St. Louis had been settled. Indeed, only a few pockets of unsettled land remained, including part of modern Oklahoma, the western Dakotas, and much of Montana. In a sense, the western part of the Louisiana Purchase was America's last frontier before Alaska became America's last frontier. Perhaps the western part of the Purchase was America's penultimate frontier. As the Louisiana Purchase was explored and settled, it was only a matter of time before this land would be incorporated into the United States. That's to say, before the Louisiana Territory would be made into states. It should come as no surprise that statehood followed a geographical trajectory very similar to settlement, with the most settled areas becoming states first. That is to say, political integration, like settlement, reflected the same tale of two purchases theme. As of 1820, only Louisiana had been carved out of the Purchase and made into a state. This was in 1812, and part of Louisiana came from other territorial acquisitions beyond the Purchase. This early admission to the Union made sense given the prominence of New Orleans as a major port and one of the oldest cities in the United States. Farther up the Mississippi River, Arkansas and Missouri were being organized. Once again, these territories were already partially settled at the time of the Purchase and had a head start toward statehood. The rest of the Purchase was still largely wilderness. By 1840, the picture had changed significantly. Missouri and Arkansas were now states, 1821 and 1836 respectively, and a new Iowa territory had been formed that embraced not only the modern state of Iowa, but much of Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas. The western part of the Purchase remained unorganized frontier. By 1860, both Iowa in 1846 and Minnesota in 1858 had joined the Union, creating a string of states on the eastern side of the Purchase. The western side, or the Great American Desert, was starting to be organized with the creation of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, the latter of which included all of the Dakotas. But substantial pockets of unorganized wilderness areas remained. In the case of Oklahoma, much of this land was left untouched as a part of Indian Territory. By 1880, Kansas and Nebraska had entered the Union in 1861 and 1867 respectively, and the remaining lands had been organized into territories that eventually became states. The purchase was finally losing its frontier status and being integrated politically into the geographic fabric of America. By 1900, it was a done deal, as they say, with all the purchase officially made into states save Oklahoma. Indeed, in the 1889 to 1890 two-year period alone, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana received statehood. By 1910, the Louisiana Purchase was integrated into the political organization of the United States, including Oklahoma, which was the last territory to be made into a state in 1907. Even with political integration, however, the two sides of the purchase were still quite visible. In other words, the tale of two purchases theme was still being played out. We can see the spatial duality of the purchase when we look at population distribution. In the graphic, you will see red dots on the map of the United States. Each dot indicates a settlement. Larger dots indicate larger cities or clusters of cities. You can see very clearly, for example, the megalopolitan areas of the Boston to Washington, the Chicago to Pittsburgh, and the San Diego to San Francisco corridors, among others, I should add. On the other hand, there are so few dots in Nevada as to suggest that nobody lives in the state outside of Las Vegas and Reno, which is not too far from the truth. Inside the purchase area, most of the dots are concentrated in the east, which is to say that most of the population is found in the east. Look at Iowa, for example, which has a proliferation of towns scattered in a more or less even fashion across the state. Indeed, this type of distribution is found from southern Minnesota in a swath that extends through eastern Kansas. This is a classic pattern of settlements found in agricultural areas. If we look at the western half of the purchase, however, the red dots become fewer in number, and in some cases they disappear altogether. In other words, few settlements exist. Those towns that do exist are generally arrayed in a linear fashion, reflecting the importance of locating on a transcontinental rail line, a major highway, or a watercourse. Look especially at North Dakota. The towns in North Dakota tend to be aligned along a series of east to west axes. This pattern of settlement suggests that agriculture is less intense. By the time we get to Montana and Wyoming, few dots exist at all. The duality of the purchase is especially apparent when we look at population density by county, with higher densities indicated by the darker shades. Note how densely populated even the most rural counties in Iowa are, ranging from 11 to 50 people per square mile. Similar rural densities are found throughout the eastern half of the purchase. By comparison, notice the very light shades of the counties in the western half of the purchase, in Montana and Wyoming, for example, and in western parts of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Even the most densely populated counties of the western half, shall we be so bold as to call them the urban counties, have densities less than most of the rural counties in the east. The major exception to our findings is the Colorado Springs to Denver corridor in Colorado, which constitutes one of the most densely populated regions anywhere in the United States, with over 500 people per square mile. We won't go into the reasons for this here. The population change map shows that much of the western purchase is not only has low population densities, but has been losing people. Many counties in the Dakotas, Montana, Nebraska, and Kansas lost in excess of 10% of their populations between 1990 and 2000, as the dark green color indicates. Exceptions to this trend can be identified in south-central Montana and parts of Wyoming, although in Wyoming the original populations are sometimes so small that only a few people will cause a significant percentage change. The Denver metropolitan area, of course, stands in marked contrast with exceptional population gains. On the eastern side of the purchase, the patterns are mixed, with rural counties generally in decline. The agricultural patterns of the purchase clearly confirm the duality. The eastern half of the purchase, excluding for the moment Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, is a part of America's Great Corn Belt. Actually, only the western part of the Corn Belt, which begins in Ohio. We could easily slip into images of American Gothic when we think of the family farm in Iowa, the cornfields, the big red barns, the cattle. And what would the University of Nebraska football team be called if eastern Nebraska were not part of the Corn Belt? Anything other than Cornhuskers would sound almost un-American. Nebraska and Iowa together produce almost 30% of all the corn grown in the United States. Actually, Iowa is as much a part of America's meat belt as corn belt, since Iowa farmers have found a profit in using their corn to fatten cattle and pigs, as opposed to selling corn outright. It's interesting to note that Iowa has slightly fewer than 3 million people, but over 15 million pigs. In the western part of the purchase, the emphasis is on wheat. In fact, the Plains region from Oklahoma to North Dakota lies at the heart of America's breadbasket. But then this makes sense. Wheat is a grass, and the western part of the purchase is mainly a grassland. Wheat can withstand semi-arid conditions. In Oklahoma and Kansas, in the so-called winter wheat belt, wheat is planted in the fall, allowed to lie dormant in the winter, and harvested in the late spring. This wheat is soft wheat and is best for making spaghetti, crackers, and pastries. Imagine that, Kansas as the pasta belt. In the Dakotas, on the other hand, the so-called spring wheat belt, wheat is planted in the spring and harvested in the late summer. This type of wheat, referred to as hard wheat, is best for making bread. As we proceed farther to the west in the purchase, wheat cultivation gives way to livestock grazing. The climate is now too dry for much of anything else unless irrigation is used. So what can we say in summary? We began with a look at what people knew about the world in 1800, noting that their knowledge of continental positions and shapes was pretty good, but their understanding of continental interiors was not so good. Jefferson, as erudite and educated as he was, had a vision of the interior West that bordered on fantasy. We examined how the United States stumbled into its acquisition of the whole Louisiana Territory, not just New Orleans. We analyzed what the U.S. took possession of in terms of physical geography, along with some of the boundary and geopolitical implications of this acquisition. And we reviewed the process in which the purchase was integrated geographically into the rest of the United States. Throughout, we acknowledged the dual geographical nature of the purchase. We can conclude by stressing once again just how important to the United States the Louisiana Purchase turned out to be. The purchase gave the United States a physiographically unified territory in the form of the Mississippi River Basin and its many river transportation corridors. The United States received one of the planet's great agricultural resources. Geopolitically, the purchase provided the United States with a springboard into the beckoning lands of the far West. This conclusion remains true despite the dual geographical nature of the purchase, what I referred to above as the tale of two purchases. Yes, Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long were right to segment, at least in their minds, the purchase into an unusable western desert and a productive eastern farmscape. Yes, it is correct to observe that today the western part of the purchase may be suffering more than the eastern part in terms of population decline and economic distress. As it turns out, however, the bad West versus the good East, the agricultural have-nots versus the agricultural haves, the desiccated plains versus the watered prairies were exaggerated dichotomies. It's true that differences existed in the 19th century and they remain today, but they are differences based less on quality than on regional character. As we have discovered, the western part of the Purchase was never meant to be an intensively used mixed farming region like the eastern part. The climatic resources simply would not permit it. But neither was the western part of the Purchase a write-off. The great American desert, of which Pike and Long despaired, turned out to be the great American breadbasket. A large proportion of the world's wheat is produced in this desert. In other words, the duality continues, but oh, how nice. Indeed, the next time that you bite into a steak from a corn-fed cow from Iowa or munch on a cracker from the wheat belt, you should be given pause to remember that it all began with a little land deal made by Jefferson and the geographical duality that resulted.
To learn more about the Louisiana Purchase and the rich history of Louisiana, visit the Louisiana State Museum's Cabildo, located on historic Jackson Square in the heart of the New Orleans French Quarter.